Maria Jenkins stood shivering in the dark, the metallic taste of blood and copper filling her mouth as she stared at the glowing screen of her son's teddy bear. Inside the plush stuffing sat a high-tech microphone, its red light pulsing like a heartbeat. Placed there not by the corporation, but by her own best friend. Behind her, the massive pumps of the Flint water treatment plant began to roar. A sound Maria knew meant thousands of gallons of corrosive chemicals were being unleashed into the city's veins. She was locked in a reinforced steel vault, her fingers raw and bleeding from clawing at the electronic lock, while a text message on her phone showed her 7-year-old son being wheeled into an undisclosed facility by men in tactical gear. "The insurance, Maria." Her mentor's voice crackled over the intercom, dripping with a terrifying, calm logic. "If you leak the truth, the city goes bankrupt and the victims get nothing. If you stay silent, they live, but they burn from the inside out." Maria looked at the lead ledger, clutched in her hand. The document that proved the entire poisoning wasn't an accident, but a calculated kickback scheme. With the pumps vibrating through the floor and her son's life hanging on a GPS ping, Maria realized the system wasn't just broken. It was designed to consume her. She had exactly 60 seconds to decide. Save the city's future or save the boy who was currently being stolen in her name. The fluorescent lights in the Flint water treatment plant buzzed with a relentless, sickly frequency, casting a jaundiced glare over the chipped countertops of the laboratory. Maria Jenkins leaned over the lead testing sensor, her fingers slick with a thin film of condensation that beaded along the machine's damp casing. She wiped her palm on her lab coat, leaving a dark smudge near the hem, and gripped the calibration dial. The device stuttered, its red warning light pulsing like a dying heartbeat against the gray concrete walls. She adjusted the sensitivity, but the numbers that flickered onto the screen remained stubbornly, terrifyingly high. Each scroll of the digital display felt like a blow to her chest. The lead levels weren't just fluctuating, they were spiking deep into the danger zone, far beyond anything the aging infrastructure could handle. The air in the lab was thick, tasting of ozone and the acrid metallic tang of chemical reagents. Maria exhaled a sharp, controlled breath through her nose, trying to steady the tremor in her hands. She knew this machine. She had spent 15 years maintaining the delicate balance of Flint's lifeblood. And it wasn't lying. The chemical imbalance within the primary processing system had reached a terminal state. Somewhere in the labyrinth of pipes and vats behind her, the system was failing, and the water flowing toward the city's taps was transforming into something predatory. She slammed the side of the device with the heel of her hand, desperate for a different result. But the red glare only intensified, reflecting in her bloodshot eyes. This nightmare had begun in earnest only a week ago, following the hollow triumph of her promotion to supervisor. Maria had spent years believing in the sanctity of protocols, thinking that if she followed the rules, the world would remain orderly. Now, staring at the undeniable data, she realized she was presiding over a catastrophe. The reports on her screen showed a systematic failure in the filtration process that defied accidental explanation. It was too precise, too sudden. She scrolled through the flow rates and the pH balances, her mind racing to find a benign cause, a broken valve, a faulty batch of lime. But the numbers pointed toward a deliberate neglect. The promotion felt like a lead weight in her pocket. They had given her the title just as the rot became impossible to hide, perhaps hoping her reputation for diligence would serve as a shield for their incompetence. As she stared at the screen, the realization settled into her bones. The city's water supply was being poisoned, and her name was at the top of the shift log. She wasn't just a witness. She was the face of the failure. The silence of the lab was broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the pumps in the distance, a sound that usually comforted her, but now sounded like the heavy, labored breathing of a beast. The heavy steel door creaked open, and the rhythmic clicking of boots on linoleum echoed through the room. Maria didn't turn. She knew the cadence of the private security guards who had become a permanent fixture since the transition. Two men moved into her peripheral vision, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the laboratory floor. They didn't wear the friendly, slightly rumpled uniforms of the municipal guards she had known for years. These men were encased in tactical black, their faces set in expressions of practiced indifference. They loomed over her, their presence shrinking the room until Maria felt the heat of their proximity. "The logs, Jenkins," one of them said, his voice a flat metallic rasp. He tapped a gloved finger on the clipboard resting near the sensor. "The morning shift data needs to be finalized. Within tolerance, like we discussed." Maria's throat felt as though it were lined with glass. She looked from the red alerts on the sensor to the blank spaces on the official logbook. "The numbers are triple the legal limit," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't sign off on this. We need to bypass to the secondary reservoir and alert the council." The guard leaned in closer, the scent of stale coffee and gun oil wafting from his uniform. He didn't raise his voice, which made the threat feel more intimate. "The council knows what they need to know. You have a son, Maria. Leo, right? Second grade?" He didn't wait for an answer. He moved her hand toward the pen. "Enter the data. Keep the city quiet. That's your job now." Under the weight of their gaze, Maria felt her resolve fracture. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the pen, the plastic casing biting into her raw knuckles. She began to write, her handwriting cramped and unrecognizable, entering the falsified safety data that would tell the world Flint was safe, while the poison continued to flow. Each stroke of the pen felt like a betrayal of every oath she had ever taken. The guards watched with predatory patience, their eyes never leaving her hands until the last box was checked. A sudden crackle from the lead guard's radio broke the suffocating tension. A voice barked through the static about a delivery at the main gate, demanding immediate attention. The guards exchanged a brief, sharp glance. "Finish the summary," the taller one commanded, already turning toward the door. "We'll be back to collect the hard copy in 5 minutes." As the door swung shut behind them, the air seemed to rush back into Maria's lungs. She didn't waste a second. Her methodical, bureaucratic mind, usually her greatest shackle, now became her sharpest weapon. She reached into the cabinet beneath the sink and pulled out 3 glass vials, her movements blurred by adrenaline. She moved to the sample tap, the one that drew directly from the post-filtration line, and cracked the valve. The water that came out looked clear, but she knew the microscopic horror it carried. She filled the vials, the cold liquid splashing over her shaking fingers, and tucked them deep into the hidden pockets of her cargo pants, securing the glass against her thigh. This was the first act of resistance in a life defined by compliance, and the weight of the vials felt like live ammunition. Outside the reinforced chain-link fence, Marcus pulled his aging sedan to a stop, the engine idling with a rhythmic rattle. He climbed out, clutching a small plastic spacer and a blue inhaler. Leo's lifeline. He had noticed the boy struggling during morning recess, his breath coming in shallow, wheezing gasps that the inhaler hadn't quite managed to soothe. Marcus approached the gate, his brow furrowed as he took in the new security detail. The guards blocked his path with a wall of black nylon and unyielding posture, their hands resting near their holsters. "I'm just here to drop this off for Maria Jenkins," Marcus said, trying to maintain the warm, teacherly tone that usually disarmed people. "Her son left his medication at school. It's urgent." "No personal deliveries," the guard replied, his voice devoid of empathy. "Leave it in the bin or move along." Marcus felt a prickle of unease. He had lived in Flint long enough to recognize the smell of a cover-up, and the atmosphere around the plant had turned toxic in ways that had nothing to do with chemicals. Through the mesh of the fence, he saw Maria approaching, her pace a frantic march, her eyes darting toward the guards. She looked like a woman walking through a minefield. As Maria reached the fence, Marcus leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur that barely carried over the hum of the facility. "Maria, listen to me," he whispered, his fingers gripping the wire. "It's not just Leo. Half my class is out. Rashes, hair loss, kids falling asleep at their desks. They're saying it's a flu, but it's not. It's the water, isn't it?" The words hit Maria with the force of a physical blow. She looked at the inhaler in Marcus's hand, then back toward the lab where she had just signed her name to a lie. The image of Leo's peers, children she had seen at birthday parties and little league games, suffering because of her silence, broke the last of her hesitation. "It's worse than you think, Marcus," she breathed, her voice a ragged ghost of itself. "Tell the parents to stop drinking it. Use the bottled stuff. Don't even let them bathe in it. I'm getting proof. I'm going to make them see." The determination in her eyes was a new, terrifying thing. She saw the security contractor, a man named Miller, who had been watching her from the loading dock, start to move toward them. His eyes were fixed on the suspicious bulge in her pocket where the vials were hidden. "Hey, Jenkins, away from the fence!" Miller shouted, his stride lengthening. Maria turned, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Miller was a broad-shouldered man with a face like carved granite, and he didn't look like he was interested in a conversation. He intercepted her 10 yards from the gate, his hand reaching out to snag the strap of her heavy canvas bag. "What did he give you?" Miller demanded, his voice a low growl. "Empty your pockets, now. It's my son's medicine, you idiot," Maria snapped. But her voice lacked the conviction of a good liar. She felt the cold glass of the vials pressing against her leg, a ticking clock of exposure. Miller didn't listen. He lunged for the bag, his fingers brushing the fabric. In a moment of pure, unadulterated instinct, Maria reached into the side pocket of her bag and closed her hand around a heavy brass sample canister. As Miller reached for her again, she swung it in a short, brutal arc. The metal connected with his wrist with a sickening crack. Miller let out a choked cry of pain, his hand recoiling as if he'd touched a live wire. Maria didn't wait to see the damage. She spun on her heel and bolted, her boots skidding on the slick concrete of the plant floor. She didn't head for the exit. They would have the gates locked in seconds. Instead, she dived into the shadows of the chemical vats area, a cavernous space where the air was thick with the scent of chlorine, and the floor was a maze of pipes and steel supports. She could hear Miller's radio barking behind her, calling for backup, the sound echoing off the high corrugated ceiling. She moved with the frantic grace of the hunted, weaving between the towering stainless steel tanks. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for her. She knew this floor better than any of the men chasing her. She knew the blind spots of the cameras and the places where the steam pipes groaned loud enough to drown out her footsteps. She reached the door to the main administrative wing, her lungs burning, and slipped inside. The climate-controlled air of the office feeling like a cold shroud. The administrative office was a graveyard of old paperwork and flickering monitors, the heart of the plant's digital nervous system. Maria knew the guards would be checking the perimeter first, giving her a window, a narrow, evaporating window, to find the one thing the vials couldn't provide: the paper trail. She bypassed the secretary's empty desk, her eyes fixed on the main server terminal in the corner. The red light of the security lockdown was already pulsing in the hallway, casting rhythmic flashes of crimson across the room. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of practiced motion. She wasn't looking for water quality reports anymore. She was looking for the money. She found a directory labeled Project Achilles, a name she had never seen in any official municipal briefing. It was encrypted, a wall of high-level code that should have stopped her. But the password was a lazy string of characters she'd seen Vance use a dozen times. The folder opened, and Maria's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a list of chemical orders, it was a purchase agreement. She fumbled a USB drive from her pocket, the encrypted one she'd kept for emergency backups, and slammed it into the port. Copying, 12%, 45%. The sound of heavy boots thudded in the corridor. Shouts echoed closer. She stared at the progress bar, her teeth gritting until her jaw ached. 98%, 100%. She yanked the drive out just as the door handle began to rattle. She didn't head for the door. She scrambled through a narrow ventilation access behind the server rack, a space she'd only ever seen used by technicians. She crawled through the dark, the smell of dust and old grease filling her nose, until she reached an exterior vent that opened into the overgrown weeds behind the facility. She tumbled out into the cool Michigan night, the drive clutched in her hand like a holy relic. An hour later, huddled in the back of a 24-hour diner 3 towns over, Maria plugged the drive into her old laptop. The screen flickered to life, revealing a web of corporate entities that made her head spin. This wasn't a city failure. The Flint water treatment plant had been sold 6 months ago to a multinational conglomerate called Vanguard Resource Group. The city council hadn't just switched the water source to save money. They had sold the entire infrastructure to a private entity that was using the city as a test bed for low-cost, high-toxicity filtration methods. The documents were explicit. There were spreadsheets calculating the acceptable loss of the local population against the profit margins of bypassing the anti-corrosive treatments. The orders to spike the water with cheaper, more caustic agents hadn't come from a harried city manager. They had come from a penthouse office in Chicago. Maria stared at the signatures on the digital directives, senior executives who had never stepped foot in Flint, men who viewed her son's health as a rounding error on a quarterly report. The scope of the malice was breathtaking. It wasn't negligence. It was an extraction. The weight of the discovery felt like it was crushing her chest. She wasn't just fighting a corrupt mayor or a lazy department head. She was fighting a ghost, a corporate entity with more lawyers than Flint had doctors. She closed the laptop, her reflection in the darkened window looking like a stranger. The woman who believed in systems was dead. In her place was someone who knew that the only way to survive a rigged game was to burn the board. The drive was a death warrant, and Maria knew it. She sat in the dim light of the diner, the smell of burnt coffee and floor wax grounding her as she planned her next move. She had the samples, and she had the data. But as she looked at the time, she realized the 2-hour window she had carved out was already closing. The system she had betrayed was already hunting her, and the first person it would send was the man who had taught her everything she knew. The headlights of a black SUV swept across Maria's front porch, the beams cutting through the evening gloom like searchlights. She stood in the center of her living room, the stolen USB drive clutched so tightly in her palm that the edges bit into her skin. A heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards, the sound of a car door closing with expensive finality. Then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing with a familiarity that made Maria's stomach churn. Robert Vance didn't knock. He pushed the door open, his tailored suit a sharp, dark contrast to the peeling wallpaper and cluttered toys of Maria's home. He looked around the room with an air of disappointed paternalism, his manicured hands resting in his pockets. "You always were the smartest person in the room, Maria," Vance said, his voice a smooth, practiced rumble. "Which is why I can't understand why you're being so incredibly stupid right now." Maria didn't move. "I saw the purchase agreements, Robert. Vanguard Resource Group. I saw the acceptable loss projections. Did you sign off on those, or did you just look the other way while they did it?" Vance sighed, a sound of genuine weariness. "The city was bankrupt. We were going to lose the schools, the police, everything. Vanguard offered a lifeline, a way to keep the lights on. Yes, there were adjustments, temporary measures." He stepped closer, his eyes hardening. "But you've crossed a line. You stole proprietary data. That drive is corporate property, and taking it is a federal offense. I have 2 officers waiting in the car, Maria. Give me the drive, and I can tell them it was a misunderstanding. I can protect you." "Protect me?" Maria's voice dropped into a dangerous rasp. "Like you protected the kids in Marcus's class? Like you're protecting Leo?" 2 hours, Vance said, ignoring her. He checked his gold watch, the metal gleaming in the dim light. "You have 2 hours to bring that drive back to the plant. If you don't, I won't be able to stop what happens next. They'll charge you with industrial espionage. You'll lose everything. Your house, your career, and most importantly, your son. Think about what happens to Leo if you're in a federal cell for the next 20 years. He turned and walked out, leaving the door standing wide open. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Maria sank onto the couch, her mind racing through the ultimatum. She had 2 hours to choose between the truth and her life. The shrill ring of her cell phone shattered the quiet. Maria snatched it up, her heart leaping into her throat. It was the hospital. "Maria Jenkins? This is Nurse Holloway from the Hurley Medical Center ER. You need to come down here immediately. It's Leo." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What happened? Is he okay?" "He had a seizure, Maria. A grand mal. He's stable now, but his blood work? The lead levels are off the charts. We're seeing acute toxicity. The doctors need you here to sign off on the emergency chelation therapy." Maria fumbled for her car keys, her vision blurring. The ultimatum from Vance, the stolen drive, the corporate conspiracy. It all faded into a dull roar, replaced by the singular, agonizing image of Leo on a hospital gurney. She ran to her car, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She jammed the key into the ignition, the engine turning over with a reluctant groan. She shifted into reverse and backed out of the driveway, her mind already at Leo's bedside. She hit the end of the block and went to press the brake for the turn onto the main road. The pedal went straight to the floor. No, she whimpered, pumping the brakes frantically. There was no resistance, only a sickening, spongy squelch. The car surged forward, narrowly missing a parked truck as she yanked the emergency brake. The tires screeched, and the car fishtailed to a halt in the middle of the intersection. She sat there, gasping, her forehead resting against the steering wheel. It wasn't an accident. The brakes had been bled. They were trying to keep her from the hospital, or worse, they were trying to kill her. She didn't have time to process the terror. She abandoned the car, running back toward her house to call a cab, her legs feeling like lead. As she rounded the corner to her street, she froze. Her front door, which Vance had left open but she had surely closed when she ran for the car, was standing wide open again. A rectangle of yellow light spilled out onto the dark porch. Maria approached with the caution of a cornered animal. She stepped into the hallway, her eyes scanning the shadows. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The house was eerily still. She moved through the living room, her pulse thundering in her ears. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. Leo's toys were still scattered on the rug. Her laptop was where she had left it. But the air felt different. Violated. She checked the kitchen, then the bedroom. Nothing was missing. No drawers were tossed, no electronics taken. It was a psychological strike. A reminder that they could enter her sanctuary whenever they pleased. She was turning to leave when a floorboard creaked behind her. A figure stepped out of the shadows of the pantry, a man in a dark utility jacket, his face obscured by a black tactical mask. He didn't say a word. He lunged for her, his movements efficient and brutal. Maria dived behind the kitchen island, her hand closing around the handle of the kettle she'd left on the stove. It was still hot, the water inside simmering. As the intruder rounded the corner, she flung the boiling water at his face. He let out a muffled roar of agony, his hands flying to his eyes. She didn't stop. She grabbed a paring knife from the block and slashed at his reaching arms, the blade catching the fabric of his jacket. The struggle was desperate, a chaotic blur of crashing chairs and shattered glass. The intruder was stronger, but Maria was fighting for her son's life. She kicked his shin, the heavy work boots she still wore from the plant connecting with a satisfying thud. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice a primal rasp. "Get out of my house." The intruder, blinded and bleeding, realized the neighbors would be calling the police. He scrambled toward the back window, diving through the glass in a shower of shards. Maria stood in the center of the kitchen, the knife clutched in her shaking hand, her chest heaving. She needed to get to Leo. She needed to leave. But as she turned to grab her bag, her eyes fell on Leo's favorite teddy bear, a worn-out thing with one button eye that he'd had since he was a toddler. It was sitting on the counter, out of place. She picked it up, her fingers brushing against something hard beneath the fur. She ripped the seam at the back, her heart sinking. Tucked deep inside the stuffing was a small, high-sensitivity microphone. She stared at the device, her mind reeling. This wasn't professional corporate hardware. It was a local model, the kind used by the plant's internal security. She looked at the serial number etched into the side, a code she recognized from the equipment logs. It belonged to Sarah. Sarah, who had brought her coffee every morning for 5 years. Sarah, who had sat with her while she cried over her divorce. Sarah, who was the only person Maria had trusted with her fears about the water. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, deeper and more painful than anything Vance had threatened. She heard a soft sob from the doorway. Sarah was standing there, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed with tears. "Maria, I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "They told me they'd fire me. They told me they'd take my pension. I didn't think they'd actually hurt you. I had to tell them what you were saying." Maria looked at her friend, the woman who had monitored her every word, who had fed her secrets to the men poisoning her child. "Leo is in the hospital, Sarah. He had a seizure, because of the water you helped them hide." "I didn't have a choice," Sarah cried, stepping into the room. "The board. They have files on everyone, Maria. They knew about my father's bribes. They said they'd send him back to prison. I was just trying to protect my family. By destroying mine?" Maria's voice was dead, devoid of emotion. She walked past Sarah without another word, the stolen drive tucked into her pocket. She stood in the hospital hallway an hour later, the fluorescent lights reflecting in the sterile linoleum. Through the glass of the ICU door, she could see Leo, his small body dwarfed by the machines and tubes. The 2-hour ultimatum was almost up. Vance was waiting. The corporation was waiting. She looked at the drive in her hand, then at her son. If she gave them the drive, she might save herself. But she would be signing the death warrants of every other child in the city. If she kept it, she might lose Leo forever. The pressure was a physical weight, a crushing force that threatened to break her apart. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the window, the silent scream finally reaching her throat. The hospital television in the corner of the waiting room flickered with a breaking news alert. The blue light washing over Maria's exhausted face. A spokesperson for the city, a man with a smile as bright and hollow as a polished bone, announced an immediate maintenance shutdown of the Flint water system. He spoke of upgrading infrastructure and long-term sustainability, but Maria knew the translation. They weren't upgrading anything. They were preparing to flush the evidence. She had seen the chemical orders on the stolen drive. To scrub the pipes of the lead and the toxins before federal inspectors could arrive. The corporation was planning to use unapproved, highly corrosive dispersants. Chemicals so aggressive they would strip the biofilm from the pipes and send a concentrated surge of neurotoxins through every faucet in the city. It was a scorched earth policy. They would clean the evidence by dumping it into the bodies of the citizens. The realization hit her with a cold, clinical horror. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was a mass poisoning disguised as a repair. Maria looked at Leo, sleeping fitfully under the hum of the monitors, and knew she couldn't stay. She couldn't just be a mother tonight. If she didn't act, there wouldn't be a city for Leo to grow up in. She slipped out of the hospital, her movements ghost-like. She didn't have a car, but Marcus was waiting in the parking lot, his face set in a grim mask of determination. He didn't ask questions. He knew the look on her face. "I need a terminal with an unmonitored uplink," Maria said, her voice a low, urgent rasp. "The plant's internal network is compromised, but there's a relay station at the old library. If I can get in there, I can bypass their firewall." Marcus drove through the dark streets of Flint, past the boarded-up storefronts and the flickering streetlights. The city felt like it was holding its breath. At the library, Maria's fingers flew across the keyboard, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her wide, bloodshot eyes. She wasn't just sending files. She was launching a flare. She targeted the Detroit Free Press, the Associated Press, every major outlet she could think of. She watched the upload progress bar, 75%, 88%, 95%. Her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Done," she whispered as the screen flashed, "Transmission complete." "It's out. They can't hide it now." But the victory was short-lived. 10 minutes later, her phone buzzed with a message from an anonymous source at the news desk. "The story's been spiked. Injunction filed by Vanguard's legal team. D-notice issued. We can't touch it, Maria. They've scrubbed our servers." The corporation's reach was longer than she had ever imagined. They didn't just own the water, they owned the narrative. "They're starting the flush," Maria said, her voice trembling with a sudden, sharp rage. "I have to stop it manually. I have to lock the tanks." She returned to the plant under the cover of a moonless sky. The main gates were swarming with security, but she knew the service tunnels, the narrow, concrete veins that ran beneath the facility to the river. She crawled through the dark, the sound of rushing water echoing in the claustrophobic space, until she reached the sub-level of the high-pressure valve room. The air inside was sweltering, thick with the scent of hot metal and ozone. The massive pumps were already beginning to groan, a deep, rhythmic thud that vibrated in Maria's teeth. She scrambled up the ladder to the main control platform, her hands slick with sweat. She reached for the manual override lever, the one that would lock the dispersant tanks and trigger a system-wide failsafe. Step away from the controls, Maria. The voice was cold, amplified by the acoustics of the metal room. Robert Vance stood at the top of the stairs, a sleek black pistol held with the steady hand of a man who had long ago traded his soul for a seat at the table. "It's over, Robert," Maria said, her hand hovering inches from the lever. "I've seen the flush orders. You're going to kill people. I'm saving the city," Vance countered, his voice rising over the roar of the pumps. "If the federal inspectors find what's in those pipes, the lawsuits will bankrupt Flint. Every pension, every school fund, every insurance policy will be voided. There will be zero money for medical bills, Maria. Zero. If you expose this now, you're not just hurting the corporation. You're ensuring that none of these families ever get a dime for their trouble. Is that the justice you want? Absolute truth and absolute poverty?" Maria froze. The moral paradox of his words felt like a physical blow. If she stopped the flush, the evidence remained. But the city's sovereign immunity would be stripped away by the legal maneuvers Vance described. The victims, the families, the children, Leo, would be left with nothing but their sickness. If she let the flush continue, the evidence was gone. But the insurance would pay out for an unfortunate infrastructure failure. She looked at the lever, then at Vance. The roar of the machinery seemed to fill her head, a deafening symphony of industrial malice. She was trapped between two versions of a lie, and both of them ended in suffering. Vance saw her hesitation and moved. He didn't fire. He lunged, his body slamming into hers with the force of a man half his age. They spiraled toward the edge of the deep, open treatment tank, a yawning abyss of dark, churning water. Maria fought with the desperation of the damned, her fingers clawing at his face, her boots searching for purchase on the slick metal floor. She managed to twist away, her hand catching the emergency shutoff lever. She pulled it with everything she had. The machinery screeched, a sound of dying metal that echoed through the cavernous room. But before the system could lock, Vance was on her again. He didn't reach for the lever. He grabbed her by the throat and dragged her toward the back of the room, toward the reinforced chemical storage unit. Maria kicked and scratched, but the air was being squeezed from her lungs. He shoved her inside the windowless concrete bunker, the smell of bleach and sour milk hitting her like a wall. "I gave you a choice, Maria," Vance said, his voice a distorted rasp through the heavy steel door. "Now, the system will choose for you." He slammed the door, and the sound of the electronic deadbolt engaging felt like the final clod of dirt on a grave. Maria pounded on the door, her screams swallowed by the soundproof walls. And then, through the vents, she heard it. The unmistakable, terrifying roar of the main pumps starting up again. The flush had begun. The darkness of the storage unit was absolute. A heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against Maria's skin. For a moment, she allowed herself to collapse against the cold concrete floor, the sound of the distant pumps vibrating through the foundation like the heartbeat of a monster. She had failed. Leo was in the hospital, the city was being poisoned, and she was buried alive in a tomb of industrial chemicals. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, the screen's glare blinding in the dark. It was a text from an unknown number. No words, just a single, grainy photo. It showed a side entrance of a nondescript medical facility, and there, being wheeled into a white van by men in masks, was Leo. The kidnapping was the final, brutal stroke. They hadn't just silenced her. They had taken her heart. The grief transformed into a white-hot, crystalline rage that burned through the exhaustion. She wasn't going to die in a box. Maria stood up, her fingers searching the shelves in the dim glow of her phone. She knew this unit. It was where the plant kept the high-purity electrolyte solutions for the sensor batteries. She found a gallon jug of potassium hydroxide and a box of copper stripping. Her mind, honed by 15 years of engineering, began to assemble a weapon. She mixed the solution in a rusted metal bucket, her hands steady despite the adrenaline. She poured the conductive liquid into the seam of the electronic lock, the chemical reaction hissing and bubbling as it ate through the delicate circuitry. There was a sharp pop, a shower of sparks, and the heavy steel door creaked open an inch. She burst out into the valve room, her lungs burning. She didn't head for the exit. She headed for the heart of the beast. She knew the weakness of the Vanguard pumps. They were high-efficiency, low-tolerance machines. She grabbed a heavy industrial wrench from the tool rack and sprinted toward the primary turbine gears. With a primal scream, she jammed the wrench into the spinning assembly. The sound was catastrophic, a grinding, shrieking protest of metal on metal that shook the entire building. The turbine seized, the drive belt snapping with the sound of a gunshot. The roar of the pumps died instantly, replaced by the hissing of steam and the clatter of failing components. The flush was dead. She didn't stay to admire the wreckage. She slid down the narrow industrial waste chute, the metal burning her skin, and tumbled out into the debris of the plant's exterior. She didn't look back. She ran toward the city center, her clothes torn, her face smeared with grease and blood. The city council meeting hall was a fortress of marble and corruption, but the doors were open to the public for the evening session. Maria burst through the heavy oak doors just as the council president was raising his gavel to finalize the new corporate contract with Vanguard. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a blade. The room went silent. The president, a man with teeth too white and eyes too cold, stared at her with a mix of shock and fury. "Security, remove this woman immediately. She's an escaped criminal." "I have the lead ledger," Maria shouted, holding up a thick, weathered binder she had recovered from the server room during her escape. "I have the proof of the kickbacks. I have the names." She didn't wait for them to reach her. She began to read, her voice steady and loud, echoing off the high, gold-leafed ceilings. She read the dates, the amounts, and the names of the shell companies owned by the men sitting on the dais. The crowd, the parents of the sick children, the workers who had lost their jobs, the citizens of Flint, began to surge forward. The council president slammed his gavel, his face turning a mottled purple. "Seize those documents, now!" But the security guards hesitated. They looked at the angry faces of their neighbors, their friends, their own families in the crowd. They didn't move. "The chemicals weren't just cheap," Maria said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, crystalline calm. "They were supplied by a company called Clearwater Solutions, a company owned through 3 layers of holding firms by you, Mr. President. You didn't just look the other way. You sold us the poison yourself." She produced the signed incorporation papers, the final, undeniable link in the chain of corruption. The room erupted. It wasn't a protest. It was a reckoning. A wall of citizens formed a human shield around Maria, their bodies a living barrier against the corporate guards. In the chaos, a hand touched Maria's shoulder. She spun around, ready to fight, but it was Sarah. Her friend looked broken, her eyes hollow with a guilt that would never truly heal. "I tried to stop you that night," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the crowd. "The brakes. I didn't want to kill you, Maria. I just wanted to disable the car. I knew Vance had a team waiting at the hospital to take you. I thought if I kept you home, you'd be safe. I'm so sorry." The revelation of the spongy brakes was a small mercy in a sea of betrayals. But Maria couldn't find the words to forgive. Not yet. She watched as the police, pressured by the presence of the media and the sheer volume of the crowd, began to lead the council president and Robert Vance away in handcuffs. The system was broken, the city was scarred, and the road to recovery would be long and painful. Weeks later, the dust had begun to settle. The federal investigators were in the streets, the corporate lawyers were in retreat, and the water was finally being treated with the care it deserved. Maria sat on her front porch, the wood creaking softly under her weight. Her career was over, her reputation in the industry was ruined, and the guilt of her silence would stay with her forever. But then, the screen door creaked open. Leo stepped out, his skin no longer yellowed, his eyes bright with the curiosity of a boy who had been given back his future. He held a glass of water, clear, safe, bottled water, and took a long, deep drink. He looked at his mother and smiled, a lopsided, beautiful thing. Maria reached out and took his hand, her raw knuckles finally starting to heal. The system had failed them, but they were still standing. And as the sun set over the bruised skyline of Flint, Maria Jenkins finally allowed herself to breathe.